Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Jennifer Modlinger and I work for 70 Faces Media. We are so excited to be hosting this important event, responding to anti-Semitism amid rising authoritarianism, along with our partner, the Nexus Project, a national Jewish organization that defends democracy, fights anti-Semitism, and protects free speech. Now I'd like to turn things over to Alan Solo, the board chair of the Nexus Project and former chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, who will introduce our moderator and esteemed panelists. Alan?
Thank you, Jen, and welcome to all of you who are joining us this afternoon for this important session. As Jen mentioned, here at Nexus, we're aligning the fight to save our democracy and to combat anti-Semitism. If you'd like more information on us, you can always go to nexusproject.us. With that, let me introduce our panelists for this session. First, Ambassador Susan Rice. Ambassador Rice served as the United States Ambassador to the United Nations. She also was the National Security Advisor to President Obama and served as the Domestic Policy Advisor to President Biden. In that latter capacity, she spearheaded the creation of the first United States national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, released in May of 2023, bringing together more than 1,000 stakeholders across the Jewish community. The national strategy, the first whole-of-society document to address anti-Semitism, was met with widespread bipartisan acclaim across both the Jewish community and the entire political spectrum. Ambassador Rice has spent her entire career advancing human rights worldwide and strengthening democratic institutions, both domestically and internationally. Ambassador Rice, we're so delighted that you're joining us today. Ambassador David Saperstein was appointed the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom under President Obama. He served for more than 20 years as director of the Religious Action Center, the Union for Reform Judaism's advocacy arm in Washington, D.C. He currently serves as Director Emeritus. Rabbi Saperstein has spent his career as a leading Jewish voice for civil rights, religious liberty, and cross-faith cooperation. He's an integral part of our efforts at Nexus. And Rabbi Saperstein, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. And finally, Jonathan Jacoby is the president and national director of the Nexus Project. He has led Nexus since its earliest days, when it created the Nexus definition, which was welcomed by the U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism. Jonathan was the first director of the New Israel Fund and the founding director of the Israel Policy Forum. For more than 40 years, he has been a leading voice for peace and justice in the Middle East and for protecting democracy and fighting anti-Semitism. With that, Johnny, I'm going to ask you to take the lead here and bring on our two experts.
Thanks very much, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be with you, Ambassador Rice and Ambassador Saperstein. It's no accident that you're our guests today. As you heard from Alan, you have both been on the front lines of the fight to ensure Jewish safety and to preserve our democracy. And I say the fight in the singular because combating anti-Semitism and countering authoritarianism today go hand in hand. Nexus understood this early on when we drafted a definition of anti-Semitism that didn't put it at odds with free speech and constitutional rights. And when this president was elected, we saw how he and his associated used anti-Semitism as a political weapon to undermine democratic rights and constitutional rights. We saw how the Heritage Foundation attempted to manipulate Jewish fears by demonizing critics of Israel in its so-called anti-Semitism strategy, which they called Project Esther, which is really just a tool for implementing the infamous Project 2025. We released our own strategy for fighting anti-Semitism and protecting democracy around the Jewish holidays, the Shofar Report, which rejects the Heritage Foundation's vision. The Shofar Report asserts that protecting democracy is a foundational strategy for combating anti-Semitism. It offers recommendations to strengthen protections for civil rights and democratic institutions, to invest in education, and to build cross-community alliances, all in order to fight authoritarianism and anti-Semitism. So in that spirit, my first question to you is simply, how do you see anti-Semitism being used to undermine American democracy? Ambassador Rice, thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Jonathan and Alan, for the invitation to join you. It's great to be part of this discussion, and to do it with David Saperstein is a huge honor. So I'm very grateful. Let me just try to address the question with initially with just a small bit of context, and then dive right in. As Alan mentioned, I was honored to be able to lead the effort to develop and disseminate the first U.S. national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which was rolled out in late May of 2023. And that strategy was focused around 4 pillars of action and over 100 U.S. government commitments, plus hundreds of recommended steps for Congress, for society as a whole, the private sector, civil society, tech companies, etc. And the Biden administration fully implemented all of the commitments that it made on behalf of the executive branch within the timelines that were promised. But then just 6 months later came the horrific events of October 7th and the devastating terrorist attacks by Hamas against the people of Israel. And thereafter, of course, campus protests ensued, anti-Semitism surged, attacks on Jewish students and institutions likewise, went to extraordinary extremes. And it's frankly been a nightmare from the vantage point of combating anti-Semitism here in the United States and internationally ever since. And most recently, as none of you need to be reminded, we've seen the murder of the 2 Israeli embassy employees, the vicious attack in Boulder, the arson attack on Governor Shapiro's home. And it feels like, we've reached a new low. And into this toxic mix has come Donald Trump again. And rather than try to tamp down anti-Semitism, he's weaponized it. And he is drawn, as Jonathan said, on Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation's Project Esther, to use anti-Semitism as a weapon in his campaign to destroy American democracy and entrench authoritarianism. He's harnessed anti-Semitism as a cudgel, as a pretext to bully and defund universities, to attack their students and faculty, to harass media organizations in order to silence any criticism of him. He's used it to eradicate diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiatives, and to chill free speech and academic freedom. And also to discredit and to starve scientific research and medical research. And to then, of course, as is becoming increasingly and horrifically apparent, he is demonizing and disappearing immigrants as part of a sweeping campaign to cleanse the United States of immigrants and people of color and religious minorities, all while politicizing and contorting definitions of terrorism and extremism. And when you add it all up, in short, this is about an effort to weaken institutions that foster critical or independent thinking and that can oppose Trump's authoritarian campaign. So let's be serious. I mean, Trump could give a damn about anti-Semitism. He's appointed committed anti-Semites to key roles at the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, and elsewhere. He's stoked hatred. He's used horrific anti-Semitic tropes. He's recently defended Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes. He's undermined and dismantled efforts to combat domestic terrorism, hate-fueled violence, and white supremacist organizations. And instead, he's invigorated and validated white supremacy under the guise of restoring so-called Western culture and values. It is not less than an effort to return us to the 19th century. And then when you look at what he's doing abroad, just read the recently released national security strategy. which explicitly backs fascist movements in Europe like the AfD against our democratic allies, while we jettison any pretense of support for democracy and human rights in our foreign policy. And all of that puts Jews at much greater risk at home and abroad. And we are now leading the way in undermining democracy globally by the example that Trump is rapidly setting here at home. So I think the answer, Jonathan, is that democracy is a tool that protects all of us, and including Jews, from the worst that can happen. And the erosion of democracy is a threat to Jews and to all Americans, but particularly Americans who may be religious minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ, disabled, anybody who is not in a very narrow white Christian nationalist elite. And we are at a moment of real true testing. And I look forward to continuing the conversation about what we can do to meet that test.
Thank you. It's something that we've been talking about, but it's always hard to hear, and appreciate the clarity with which you described what's happening. Rabbi Saperstein?
I'm into everything that Susan Wright just said. If anyone had any doubt why she's been such a remarkable leader, just listening now just reminds us of the extraordinary career of public service, Susan, that you had. I mean, key advisor on both domestic and foreign. You're probably the only person in history who held both roles. Am I right?
Yes, I think
I mean, that alone just speaks to the remarkable gift you've given this nation.
thank you, Dave.
Leadership here. So this is an extraordinary moment in history. Freedom House tells us, just to set this in context, Freedom House tells us that, and other groups that look at democracy around the globe, from the end of World War II through 2006, the midpoint of the growth of democracy and human rights was an expansive growth. Different things happen in different places in the world, but the midpoint of that was a constant growth of democracy and human rights. From 2006 through today, we've had 19 years of consistent retrenchment. Here. So this is a global crisis. And the problem of anti-Semitism and its role that we're dealing with here, often those countries that were marked by moving towards autocracy, mostly not by violent overthrow and coups, but by people who took control through a democratic election and then used the power that they had to undermine the very democracy that elected them. But very often anti-Semitism was already percolating there, or quickly did after they took power, and is instrumentally linked to the growth of autocracy across the globe. This is Steve Levitsky, the Harvard professor and co-author of How Democracies Dies, refers to this moment as competitive authoritarianism, when, because they took hold by democratic means, have elements of democracy and autocracy work together in competition with each other. And writes Levitsky, there are two bottom lines. One, you cannot placate a bully. And two, the time to resist such changes is while the democratic institutions are stronger and strongest. The weaker they are allowed to become, the harder it will be to resist. That's what we face today. The indicia of the crisis, we know, the efforts to undermine the fairness of election, exploiting the state institutions for party needs or personal gain, dismissing key independent civil service leaders, and especially the gatekeepers intended to keep the system honest, and replacing all of them with loyalists, reducing civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to protest, higher education, the things that have meant so much to the Jewish community. I'm sitting in the conference room of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, where, because the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, largest umbrella civil rights group, is located here for 30 years, the civil rights community contribution to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 65, and all of the civil rights legislation that took place and advocacy that took place through the early 1990s happened out of this very room I'm sitting in. And that brought to American Jewry more rights, more freedoms, more opportunities, more achievements than we have ever known in the entire history of Jewish diaspora life. This is something truly, truly remarkable. And we are endangered when democracy is endangered. And so we have the battle against anti-Semitism and the growth of anti-Semitism, several deep connections to the fight for democracy. First, anti-Semitism, the growth of hate crimes and hate speech in this country, much of it legitimized by the President of the United States in his rhetoric, ugly rhetoric of demonization and division of different groups in the country. Here, when minority groups who are in their rights are the indicia of a vibrant democracy, when they are shrunken and then divided to fight over the spoils of who's going to get attention, who's going to get help for their plight. Exactly the situation we place by this administration lifting anti-Semitism, though it's more important than the battles of that against LGBTQ Americans, against Latino Americans, against immigrants, against the African American community. Still more hate crimes targeting blacks than any other hate crimes in America. They're all woven together here. We won't succeed in fighting for democracy unless we are fighting for the rights of all peoples together. And the fact that in the name of anti-Semitism, this administration has, as Ambassador Rice said, sought to undermine freedom of speech, undermine freedom of the press, undermine freedom to protest, undermine civil rights, undermine academic freedom, all in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. A, divides us from key allies, and B, weakens each of us being able to work together on our common concerns. Here, there's no Noah's Ark that will protect the Jewish community if we lose the fundamental rights of all Americans in this country. The battle must go on, both focus on the individual plight of different communities, but working together to protect a democracy that protects us all. And anyone who uses us and our fight against hatred against Jews here in the name of weakening democracy, in the name of furthering right-wing extremism, in the name of furthering Christian nationalism, anyone who does that really puts us far more at risk and undermines the future of our community in America.
Thank you. I nominate you to be my pulpit rabbi.
Mine too, please. David, you captured it, beautifully and powerfully. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about the role of allyship, but it was the fourth pillar of the national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, but it is, as Nexus has highlighted and as you've just highlighted, it's the essential element to saving our democracy and protecting the rights and freedoms and security of American Jews, but Americans of all backgrounds.
Susan, I don't know if I've ever said this exactly to you. I really think that the national strategy was something
truly extraordinary in the whole history of the Jewish people. There had never been a point in our long history, even in times when we were better off and had more freedoms and opportunities in Babylonia, Alexandria, in the first centuries of the Common Era, the Golden Age of Spain, there was never a time that the whole of society and the whole of government was called to, and in the case of government, committed to fighting to protect the Jewish community when they were vulnerable and they were being hurt. In all of our history, there's never been anything like that document. And I think it will rank with the Balfour Declaration and the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel as one of the great documents of this period of Jewish history. And we are all in your debt for your leadership of that.
That's incredibly kind and completely over the top, but thank you.
Well, I say amen to that, and I want to just ask you, Ambassador Rice, to expand a little bit on the role of allyship. This next section is about strategies, and you know, people talk about Jews being the canaries in the coal mine. They come after Jews, and they're going to come after everybody else. But there are many other coal mines with many other canaries now. And we as Jews, I believe, need to be allies and we need to have our alliances. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about allyship, both in terms of how you put the strategy together and just your thoughts in general.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. When we did the national strategy, we started in December of 2022. And there's a backstory even to the strategy. As David will remember, he participated in a summit we had at the White House in September of 2022 called United We Stand. It was United Against Hate. And it brought together, people of all backgrounds, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus. It brought together Democrats and Republicans and evangelicals and Black community leaders and Jewish community leaders and Latino community leaders and disability community leaders and LGBT leaders. And it was called in the wake of what had happened in Charlottesville and in the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, and then in Buffalo, and then later in El Paso, where, at the request of five major civil rights organizations, including the ADL. And that summit was a great success and a moment of real unity. And then, just in the next couple months, Trump invites Kanye Kanye goes off and says his horrific, hate-fueled, anti-Semitic bile. And then Trump brings Nick Fuentes to Mar-a-Lago. And it was just too much. How could we have had this summit, United We Stand Against Hate, and then just sit there and watch this devolve? And Congress had asked for an interagency task force on anti-Semitism. We in the administration wanted more than a task force. Task force is fine. We said, yes, we'll call you and raise you. We'll do a task force and we'll put together a national strategy. And then I was able to go to my former colleagues at the National Security Council and to the Second Gentleman's Office and to Ambassador Lifstadt and the folks at the Holocaust Memorial Museum and pull together a very broad interagency group that spent the next 5 months in listening sessions. We listened to over 1,000 people from all elements of the Jewish community, but also from allied communities and from the Muslim community and from the evangelical community to have the foundation with which to put together that strategy. And it was, I'll be honest, it was tough sledding. There were, as you will well know, lots of differences within the Jewish community, some of which, frankly, I wasn't fully appreciative of until I got into the thick of it. At times it seemed like there was more interest in fighting over the definition of anti-Semitism than agreeing on and uniting behind concrete actions to combat anti-Semitism. But we all worked through it, and we had a lot of help from friends on the inside and outside, and we were able to put the strategy together, which was, as I said, really in significant part a call to and a reflection of allyship. So in this context, what do we do now? Well, first of all, absolutely, the Jewish community and their allies need to stand together to demand security and the resources for security, to demand respect and the freedoms to be and live on campuses and elsewhere without being harassed, without being intimidated, without being demonized. We need to stand together for those rights and stand at the same time for free speech and academic and intellectual freedom. And frankly, stand up for science, because science is directly targeted because facts and truth and analysis are antithetical to authoritarianism. And it's very much related to the phenomenon we're experiencing. And together we've got to speak out. But we also, as you said, Jonathan, we need to recognize, the dangers of what Trump is doing. As you said, and as I firmly believe, anti-Semitism truly is always the canary in the coal mine when it comes to hate. And as the national strategy emphasized, anti-Semitism threatens democracy and it threatens all minorities. And frankly, as I said earlier, this is in large part about an administration and its cronies who truly want to take the United States back to a time in the 19th century when it was white, Christian, male uh, oligarchs who controlled society, and everybody else was subordinate or excluded. And if you understand that, and by the way, I won't go into this, but they're also trying to take us back to the 19th century internationally when it comes to foreign policy, and back to a time when we had great power spheres of influence. But this is an approach that excludes the vast majority of Americans, the vast majority of Americans. And so we need to unite, or I would say reunite. We need to join together in opposition to the threats against Jews, against any minorities, against all of us. And we had the history and the experience of the civil rights movement, which was arguably the high watermark for cooperation between Black Americans and Jewish Americans. We need to do that and more. We need to broaden the tent. It needs to be everybody who is going to suffer. It's women, it's people of color, it's religious minorities, it's immigrants, whether you are a recent immigrant or you've got your citizenship through being born here to a foreign parent, or whether you've naturalized, or whether you came on a slave ship, or whether you were a Native American. We all need to come together, just as we did for the United We Stand Summit back in 2022. And I realize that this is easier said than done. I realize that there is a lot of pain and a lot of anger and a lot of mutual disillusionment, in particular since October 7th. And we need to acknowledge it. We need to own it. We need to talk about it. But we also need to move beyond that, because either we are going to join together and fight all forms of hate, and recognize that a threat to one group of Americans is a threat to all Americans, and stand up together for our democracy, or we're going to fall together, and so will our democracy. So we need to get to a mindset where we understand an attack on one is an attack on all, and hate can have no safe harbor for any of us. And I just want to say that, there seems like among some, there is a notion that in this authoritarian construct, that Jews will be fine, particularly some of the richest and most, outspoken allies of this administration. And I just think that's a delusion. And we need to call it as a delusion. It may appear in the short term that they are on the inside and somehow protected. But the project that Trump and his cronies are implementing does not include any but a very narrow few. And so what do? We need to fight authoritarianism as the existential threat that it is. And that means we got to go to school on history at home and abroad. We got to study the civil rights movement and what tools succeeded, what peaceful resistance looks like, and where it succeeded and where it failed. We got to understand, what's happened in other places like Hungary and Turkey, and even in Israel today, and many other parts of the world where democracy has slid backwards. We need to organize. We need to be willing to shame and boycott those that are capitulating to authoritarianism, those that are bending the knee, whether they're media organizations or universities or law firms or other corporate entities. And I believe the most critical thing we can do is to engage in sustained mass, peaceful, nonviolent protest. Peaceful, nonviolent protest. But it can't be every 3 months on a Saturday, as good as the No Kings effort has been. It's got to be sustained. And then finally, as to just come back to where I started, we've got to unite. We've got to unite. And I often am compelled to recall the famous quote that's attributed to Martin Niemöller, who was imprisoned for imposing the Nazis as a German. And as you know, his quotation is inscribed at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, whose board I briefly served on until I was fired by President Trump. But that quotation, as you all know, is as follows. First, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That encapsulates the moment that we are in. We have got to stand together. We have got to recognize that an attack on one group is an attack on all of us, and it is the straight out of the authoritarian playbook to demonize and divide and to disable any effective unified opposition. And we've got to ensure that that fails. So that's, Jonathan, how I would answer the question of, what do we do about, allyship and where do we need to take this so that, when we, come back together in several years' time, we don't say to one another, well, we just didn't see this coming, or we didn't understand what was at stake, or we didn't think it would, come for us. It's coming for all of us.
Thank you. David? You're muted.
That lays out the agenda very clearly of what's before us. We know the key elements of what needs to be done. And one question is why we're not doing better on some of these areas than we are. First, we resist the movement towards authoritarianism and autocracy by using the courts. Here, even with the Supreme Court in the hands of fairly far-right elements, we still have the lower court systems that have blocked again and again and again things that the president has tried to do, and has helped slow it down and give us a chance to organize more effectively against it. And we're proud of the fact that many in the Jewish community have been party in to those court cases, although I would argue not vigorously enough if you look at a lot of our national agencies that I think could do better in terms of engaging along the lines of what they did in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s on cases. Secondly, what you can't do at the federal level, you can do at the state and the local level. here. Even in purple states, we're winning victories here for women's rights, for the reproductive rights, and to stop many of the excesses. And we can work to curtail things on that level. Third, the protests. And this is an interesting one. I'd love to hear your reflection on why we have not done as well in the second term as we did in the first term. In part, I presume it has to do, he was doing it step by step in the first term. So the Muslim ban mobilized to do it. Black Lives Matter, not his action, but mobilized to deal with that when the George Floyd tragedy occurred here. And other pieces we were able to organize. Now he's doing things simultaneously across the board. And you think we got to mobilize to stop the attack on immigrants, and the next day it's an attack on the press, and the next day an attack on the media. But I'd love to hear your take on why. But I will point out something remarkable here, that if you look at Israel faces many of the same attacks on its democracy that we do. Bibi Netanyahu and the right-wing elements of his coalition are degrading democracy. The same institutions I mentioned before, they're going after the gatekeepers, the press, the judges, demonizing the judges, the legal profession, etc. There, we had the extraordinary mass protests week after week after week on behalf of judicial independence and on behalf of a ceasefire motivated by the freeing of the hostages, but the willingness to have a ceasefire, an end to the fighting to achieve that, that would sustain protests, peaceful protests, that as a proportion of the society and the sustained nature of it were the longest, largest peaceful protests in human history, I think. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. Why are we not able to do the same thing here? And what will it take? I mean, I would hope that the day that the Supreme Court says you can't do it, and he says separation of powers, try and stop me, that we would have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people in the street. But I don't know what it will take here. And then, as you said, coalitions. We can't allow the president to divide us. We can't allow us to fall victim to the Islamophobia and the racism and the anti-Semitism and the homophobia here that manifests here, and it's sought to divide us. I mean, hate speech, hate crime, hate actions against group are nothing less than attacks on the very values, the pillars of American society and the guarantors of our freedom. They are a betrayal of the promise of America here. They erode our national well-being here, and they're manipulated to achieve political goals that the far right is seeking here. And those who commit those crimes, those who are engaged in anti-Semitism and all these other forms of racism, are doing so with the intent of tearing America apart. And the best response we can have is a refusal to be divided when it comes to preserving democracy and ending all hate together here. So if you think about what happens at the local level on anti-Semitism, we're not left on our own. There hasn't been a single act of traditional anti-Semitism, of attacking synagogues or desecrating cemeteries or attacking Jews on the street, that hasn't been met with widespread response of the civic and interfaith communities of localities across the country here. And we can't walk from coalitions over the difficult issue of Israel. And we find sharp divisions about Israel. If we walk from progressive coalitions on environment and economic justice and women's rights here, extreme elements of anti-Israel forces will try and manipulate those coalitions to take positions and further exacerbate the alienation and isolation of the Jewish community, and will weaken the very cause of the coalitions as they exist, as they divide political support for them as well here. We have to stay at the table. We have to remain fighting for all of the broad universal issues that Jews have devoted so much towards and have made such a difference in the history of America. It's more important than ever today here. And, those strategies are all intact. I'll say one other. It's descriptively partisan. But if the Democratic Party does not take back one of the houses in this next election, President Trump will have no restraints on what he will do here. He will read it, no matter how narrow the election, as a mandate. Here, he'll recognize that the courts can't really act fast enough to stop him in his final 2 years, and we will have a very different country at the end of it. So I say that descriptively. If Republicans find their courage and their footing and finally say enough is enough, then it's not a partisan comment. Every achievement of social achievement of the 20th century happened because of a bipartisan coalition of decency on Capitol Hill, and nonpartisan, bipartisan, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious coalitions of decency in every community in America. We need to recapture that at this time. But until that happens, we need to stop the further erosion of democracy, or the anti-Semites are going to flourish in this way that will be extraordinarily damaging to America and its Jewish community.
Can I, Jonathan, just
Yeah.
back on something that David said? I think this question of, why has there not been, the kind of degree of protest that perhaps we've seen in the past here or in Israel. Well, first of all, there has been some, and it has been growing, and it needs to be energized and sustained. But I think one of the things we're lacking is courageous leadership. Not from necessarily political leaders, although that would be nice, but from leaders of all sorts. Civil society leaders, former government officials, religious leaders, civil rights leaders, community leaders, corporate leaders. And instead, Trump, I think you give one part of the explanation, which is it's just like a flurry of stuff that happens every day that's very hard to keep up with. But beyond that, I think we also have to acknowledge that Trump has very deliberately sought to intimidate and disable any vocal opposition. And the bending of the knee, the capitulation we're seeing in the corporate world and the university world and law firms, the media, is that we did not have in Trump 1. The Congress has been, has rolled over and played dead. And it's pathetic, it's embarrassing, it's very destructive to our democracy. But in that context, it has got to be regular people of all walks of life, including, those of us who are leaders in our own, respects and in our own context. But, we can't wait for, some great, Messiah to come from down from high and lead us to the promised land. We've got to stand up and do it ourselves, and we've got to be brave, and we've got to model courage. And we still have a constitution, we still have a Bill of Rights, and yes, they're snatching American citizens out of their cars and banging their heads onto the pavement and locking them up and disappearing them and not letting them see their lawyers and their families. We have to say that is just completely unacceptable. And we have to be brave, and as we had to be in the 1960s. David, you remember, plenty of people got their heads beat in, standing up for the right to vote. Black people, white people, people of all different backgrounds. And as you know, people gave their lives, like Goodman, Turner, and Sweeney. So so it's
The intimidation is a big thing, though. It really is. We didn't pay enough attention to the national presidential memo, National Security Presidential Memo 7, and the ability to target nonprofits that are resisting or activists that are resisting and put them on the terrorist list and take action against them. His demonizing religion and calling judges and senators, accusing them of treason here, et cetera, and the ability to shut off huge amounts of money as a weapon utterly unconnected with what the political goal is he wants. He'll stop DEI and so cut off funding for medical and scientific advancement on this. And the willingness to do that is something we've never faced before here. And I know that even in the inner deliberations of every nonprofit whose board I'm on or I'm in coalition with, everyone is thinking twice about, well, what will happen if they come after us because we do this? And I don't know what's really stilled people from doing stuff, but I think at a macro level, it has stilled the broader community from acting here. So I'm really glad that you raised that. And
we just have to realize that that's the strategy, and we can't succumb to it. I mean, he's weaponizing the Justice Department, and the list goes on and on. But if the one thing that they can't, that is, kryptonite is when we come together and when we stand with courage and resolve. And
I want to just say to that, and then I have one quick question for each of you. I want to say to that they are trying to weaponize anti-Semitism. They are trying to frighten us into not being courageous. And that's where we come in, right? That's where we have to be courageous. That's where we can't take the bait. And in that spirit, I'd love to hear from each of you just one thought or one example of something that gives us hope for the coming days. Something that we can look toward and think about as we summon up the courage to take our next steps together.
There's a lot to be discouraged about, but I frankly think that one of the things that gives me hope is the American people did not sign up for the wholesale revocation of their rights. They did not sign up, when they thought the price of eggs was too high, or they were concerned about, border security, for the inability to say what they think and to protest peacefully. They didn't sign up for the censorship of people who may speak critically of the administration or the president. They certainly didn't sign up for masked, federal agents and military forces in their cities, and ICE and CBP pulling American citizens out of their homes and their cars and disappearing them. And as that becomes understood and widely recognized not to be, something that's happening to violent criminals who are here as undocumented people, but the vast majority is happening to law-abiding people, many of whom are here legally and some of whom are US citizens. This is not what the American people want or are comfortable with. And we need courageous leaders to model, the very peaceful, nonviolent approaches to countering that kind of extremism. And the American people also didn't sign up for the mass demonization of whole groups of people based on the bad actions of or the horrific actions of an individual, whether they're Afghans or Somalis or Venezuelans or you name it. That is also not who we are in the 21st century. So that, as bad as all of that is, that gives me hope, because I think it is enough to shock the system and the vast majority of Americans into recognizing that this is not tenable.
Thank you.
So one macro, one micro response, both based on things that Ambassador Rice said earlier. First, Susan, just to build on what you were saying right now, the polling data. The polling data shows that what you are saying is absolutely correct. Even people who don't like our immigration policy and like what Trump does, doesn't like the specific actions that so violative of due process and fundamental rights and breaking up families that you talked about. And many of the broader policies they don't like, economic policies and social policies, and legal policies, et cetera. And that's really encouraging. The micro one, I'm going to pick it off of your point about there were people in the Jewish community who wanted to fight more about definitions than they wanted to actually figure out ways to effectively fight anti-Semitism. So my micro observation is Nexus. Here, if every entity in the country passed the IRA definition today, adapted it, it wouldn't change a single thing. Here, that has nothing to do with actually making a difference here. Here. But Nexus played an extraordinary role in the anti-Semitism battle in really helping to check your momentum about simple answers, that passing our definition would solve everything. Here, it succeeded in raising the complexity of how you control speech that actually steps over the line here in terms of harassment or a call to imminent violence here, and what is just ugly speech that is protected under the First Amendment. It laid out a way to protect our fundamental freedoms even while we were fighting anti-Semitism. Here, and made, I think, clear to everyone that any attempt to secure the rights and safety of Jews that undermines the rule of law, weakens our educational system, here further divides our country, here and undermines the very principles and institutions of our democracy, is going to be harmful to Jews. And I think the fact that we've had the vibrant debate that we had leading into what the national strategy said, and the way that anti-Semitism has been fought, Johnny, I think that that's a tribute to you and all of the founders of Nexus, and why I'm so proud to be a part of it. We really have made a difference, and I think have the capability, as the fight goes forward, to make even a greater difference. So those are my two hopeful, macro and micro, or more focus kind of thing that gives me hope that we really can succeed in this fight.
So I'll put in my 2 cents for my idea of hope. First of all, back to the national strategy. A reporter asked me recently about it and said, but that was a Democratic Party document. That was a partisan document, and that wasn't. That was an American document. And the people who are trying to make it partisan right now are trying to scare us away from being that kind of an American, that kind of an American, actually.
Johnny, I would just add that if this administration had simply built on what was done in the strategy and fully implemented the national strategy it was called for, we would have far less anti-Semitism, far more effective fight against anti-Semitism we're facing today. So I couldn't agree with you more, Johnny.
Alavai. Well, each of you in your own way and in many ways together bought stock in hope and perseverance a long time ago. And we absolutely are seeing those dividends. We're grateful that you're sharing those dividends with us. It's going to be a long haul. I do believe in what you said, Ambassador Rice, and what you said, Rabbi Saperstein, that The fact that we are in this together is what's going to keep us together. So I thank you both very, very much. I'll turn it over to Alan just for a few final words.
Thank you, Johnny, and thank you for your expertise in leading this conversation this afternoon. And Ambassador Rice and Ambassador Rabbi Saperstein, you add so much to our discussion and to inspire people about the importance of what is happening now and how we can combat this threat to our democracy. It's critical that each of us play our role. And while there's no single leader who is going to get us out of the predicament that we're in, when we have leaders like the two of you, and we have other people on this call today who are going to be inspired by you to go out and take their own steps, we will win this fight. And so what I would ask each of you who are listening to us today to do is to engage in this battle, to join us, to reach out either to us at Nexus directly or equally good to your colleagues in your local communities to help us build these alliances that we will need in order to succeed in this battle. Because if we stick together with our allies, we will win. So that's the first request we have of you. Second thing is, as the chairman of Nexus, I need to remind you, you should go to nexusproject.us, and I know you'll be shocked to find a donate button there. But if you want to help us support this cause and build these coalitions, we can't do it for free. We have a staff. That's how we've been able to build our effectiveness to date. So if you can find the means to support us, we'll deeply appreciate it. I want to thank you for joining us today. We've had a wonderful crowd. We've had a fantastic discussion. I couldn't be more delighted to have had our two guests, Ambassador Rice and Rabbi Saperstein, with us today. Johnny, always a pleasure to have you lead the discussion. So I thank all of you. Please reach out to us with your thoughts, your ideas, your support, your encouragement, your participation. nexusproject.us. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.